Glad to be with you, my friends. And we'll do the old share screen and get going. There we go. Let's see if we can do this. All righty. There we go. Perfect. All right. So last time, 2 weeks ago, last week, we ended up with, it was the Lynn and Bill Club last week, which we had a nice little chat. But the week before, we looked at chapter 10. That was the Good Shepherd, and where Jesus says, I am the Good Shepherd, and I am the gate, and I am the light, right? So he's talking about all these different things. And then there's what does the community have to say to him during Hanukkah is the season that is all set in. So we have a pretty clear idea that that's a December time frame. This week we go from the Good Shepherd to Lazarus. And really what we're shifting now, you'll see, is from Jesus's public ministry. That is, before this, he is very much teaching to the community at large. And then much more at this point, after this, he turns to a private ministry. That is, he is talking mainly to the disciples and to the insiders in his movement. And so there's a pretty big shift moment. Well, as we walk through, you'll see why. We'll just jump right in. Now, a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair, and her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Certainly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after hearing that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. And after this, he said to his disciples, go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you. Are you going there again? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble, because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble, because the light is not in them. After saying this, he told them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right. Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death. He thought he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us go also. We may die with him. All right. So much has happened in these verses. First, we have to identify Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. Lazarus only shows up in the Gospel of John. Mary and Martha show up in Luke and a variety of, actually, I think they show up in all four Gospels. But certainly the main other story, the one that we know typically about Mary sitting at the foot of Jesus while Martha's working, right? Story comes from Luke. They are from Bethany, which is near Jerusalem. That's where Jesus shows up in Luke 10. So there's one Bethany. But then we also have an interesting one. At the end of chapter 10, Jesus went to where John was baptizing across the Jordan. If you don't remember, in the Gospel of John, John the Baptist baptizes across the Jordan in a town called Bethany. So Jesus is in Bethany, but a different Bethany, while Lazarus is in a Bethany. And you have this sort of interesting connection there that's very explicit. I mean, but it's a little bit under the radar at the same time, because you have to go back to the beginning of the story to remember that John was baptized in a Bethany there. Historians know where the Bethany near Jerusalem is. They have a pretty good idea of where that was. It's only 2 miles from the temple, give or take, which was now, of course, central Jerusalem. But in those days, and so they have an idea of where that part, but they have no idea exactly where on the far side of the Jordan John was baptized. Some of that is historical and some of that is political nowadays. Historical in that they haven't found anything, and there's also no real record of John building anything there where he was baptizing. He was just sort of inviting people to jump in a river, right? So there's not a town or anything that sort of says, oh, this is the exact spot. And then it's political because there's lots of tourist dollars and money to be made. So there are, as I understand it, 3 or 4 spots that all claim to be the exact place on the Jordan where Jesus was baptized, or the exact place on the Jordan where John was baptizing. But there's not clarity around any of them. They all have different historical records that sort of prove them, but they're not known. So names matter in scriptures. And especially these names, because we haven't had a name about anybody here in a while. We've had lots of good shepherds and other sort of stories, but not actual names. Lazarus is likely a shortened version of Eleazar, which means God helps. You have Lazarus, whom God helps. Then you have Mary, that means bitter, beloved, or rebellious, a little bit of everything, right? And then Martha is bitter. Literally, Martha is a Hebrew word that means bitter. So Bethany also then means house of affliction. So without actually before we even know what's going on in the story, we get the name Bethany. There's a house of affliction. Lazarus is sick there, whom God will help, right? We almost have an idea of exactly how the story will go, and Mary and Martha are both a little bitter, beloved, and rebellious, right? They're conflicted at least. So this is that fascinating thing that a lot of times in Scripture, you know the names or how they're at least translated, you start to realize, oh, there's more to this than we thought, even from. So we'll do the short version first. Jesus hears his friend is sick. He's pretty indifferent and believes that this is all to glorify God. He chooses to go knowing that he is facing death. And here's the key. He knows he's facing death on a couple of different levels, both his death and Lazarus, right? In the previous chapter, the community was trying to stone him. The Jews were trying to stone him for being a heretic. So there's a pretty clear idea that going to this part of the world near Jerusalem is to put himself in harm's way. The other side is he knows that Lazarus has died. And so it's very much, this is a moment where Jesus is operating like he always does in the Gospel of John on multiple levels, but he's especially operating on 2 different levels here with death, thinking about his own death, knowing that that's going to come, and that his friend Lazarus has died and he needs to go and help. So you get a little bit of both. Finally, in that last part, we get Thomas the twin, and Thomas and twin mean the same thing, just depending on if you're using Greek or Hebrew. So the twin shows up. We're not sure who's the twin of, but he's a twin, and he shows up for the first time. And unlike that doubting moment that he gets he gets blamed for later, he's actually the one person who says, "Hey, let's just go with Jesus. If he's going to die, then we should just die with him." Interesting sort of counterpoint to the guy that is almost fearful after Easter. Here he is pretty fearless and willing to do anything to be with Jesus and go with him. So fundamental questions here are pretty clear. Does God care about our suffering, right? That's the underlying question that we have on so many things, especially in our world right now with a pandemic going on. Does God care about our suffering? And we get this sort of interesting image of Jesus seeming to care, but also not seeming to be too worried about it. And there's that other question, where is God during our suffering? In this case, he is in Bethany, but not the right Bethany, right? He's around, but not quite in the right space at the right time. If we're going to look at this story purely through those lenses, it has an interesting sort of combination of things to say. So again, Jesus is both in Bethany and not particularly worried about it. So is God indifferent to our suffering, or is that the final answer? Or is there Is there more to it? And as we get through the story, I think there is a lot more to be said about it. What else did you hear in those opening verses about Lazarus? So I can say when I was reading it, I got tripped up because there in verse 13, there is that nicely unknown, right? Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death. It's one of those like, which death? Jesus's death or Lazarus's death, right? In the context, it seems to be saying that he was talking about Lazarus, who actually had died. He hadn't fallen asleep. But there is almost this idea a lot of times of Jesus is also speaking about his own death, about everyone that might have fallen.
I think it's interesting that when the disciples comment, Rabbi, you can't do that, the Jews are out to kill you, he responds by going into this light dark discussion. Are there not 12 hours of daylight?
Yeah.
And I'm certain that that's a significant point, in terms of what the gospel writer wants to convey here, but it's not that easy for me to follow it.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be an answer, does it? For sure.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder how Jesus knew that Lazarus had fallen asleep. Just because he's Jesus, or somehow or another somebody told him, but there's no indication that anybody told him.
Right. Yeah. There is that supernatural aspect of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That he has this idea of something that's happened, or knows exactly what's happened, but we don't have any idea who said it, right? We have an idea that he got warned things were going to happen, but not a clear idea of when.
And he was in no hurry to go and help. He stayed 2 days longer after they were pleading for him to come. And
well, we can do the math. When he gets there, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. So if he waited 2 days, and it probably took it was a 2 days journey. It sounds like a 2 days walk to get back as well, right? Like he almost has to at least be a 2 days walk, maybe 3 or 4 to go to get between the two locations.
right.
So yeah, there's travel time in there too. That doesn't help. He's not in a hurry.
Well, if you look at it from a science perspective, when you die, your body, as it cools off, leads into rigor mortis and other forms of deterioration. So if it had been 4 days, a lot would have been going bad for this man from the scientific standpoint. He would be deteriorating.
Right. Yeah.
So maybe the disciples knew a little something. He wasn't really dead. He was just, in a stroke-like situation or something. I don't know.
Well, they just assumed he was, when Jesus said he was sleeping, that he was just sleeping like we go to sleep at night. Not that he was dead.
And it's not unfair to say that in the ancient world, there are lots of cases where they didn't know the difference between death and coma, right? Or death and some severe situations that we would very clearly have a different idea of now, because we can check brain activity and heartbeats and all kinds of different things, respiratory issue stuff. But in the ancient world, if you really slowed down a whole lot, there would be times that there's more than a few cases of people jumping back up after a few days that they thought were dead because they were either in a short-term coma or had been poisoned on some level. There's a whole variety of different things.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, we'll keep going. So, when Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." "Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." So, actually, real quick, this is, I didn't even put this in here, I don't think. That's actually one of the other big readings. 2 weeks ago, we talked about I am the Good Shepherd, and that's one of the big readings that you will hear a lot of times at funerals. This is another one that you will hear a lot. This particular part, I've always found it interesting. We have this exchange that we put in the readings, in the gospel readings for a funeral, but we don't put the actual moment when Jesus raises up Lazarus. That's off. We just focus on this exchange between Jesus and Martha. So I think this part of the story can be read in 2 ways. One is the sort of traditional 50s faithful responses model, where Martha comes out in awe of Jesus and sadness that he hadn't been able to heal. We have Martha as this disappointed believer, right? I believe in you, but it's all this sort of, not stilted, but it's very, it's sort of like platitudes you would say at a funeral, right? Like if you can read it that way to a certain degree, like, "Oh, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Oh, he'll rise again. I know he'll rise on the last day," kind of, and you can almost hear that conversation at a funeral. A second way is that I think you can also read, and I think more fair to read, Martha is just bitter, heartbroken, and full of accusation and sarcasm. I don't think it is purely a statement of faith as much as like, "Where have you been, buddy? If you had been here, you jerk, you would have died." I think it is a fair thing to have Martha, who comes storming. Quite frankly, you almost get this idea that she's coming storming out of the house to meet Jesus on the road before he can even get there, to sort of point at him in an accusational role, right? Both can be read out of what's written, because we never have a sarcasm font. We never really have an idea of how someone delivers a line. Both can be read here. I just personally feel sometimes the humanity side of it says the second way may make a little more sense. So again, she doesn't run out to greet him as much as she runs out to say, "Where the hell were you?" So it could be exchange you hear at the funeral. It could be either way. But what do y'all hear in these verses? Because it's a great exchange, but it's also one that has a lot of sort of broad ideas without a lot of.
I think it's just very human, that human response. If she knows Jesus could raise Lazarus if he chooses to, but what's he waiting for?
Yeah. I think it was probably that second that she was so upset. She had seen him heal all these people, and she knew if he'd been there, he could have healed her brother. So right. Where were you? We sent for you. What took you so long?
Yeah. So
yes, this.
Go ahead.
It's this interesting portrayal of Jesus. I mean, it's quite Johannine. I mean, this is the same Jesus who goes willingly and knowingly to the cross to fulfill God's will, This is, who speaks almost with tongue in cheek a lot of times, knowing that he's a step ahead and his mind is operating at a different level. And yet it does seem to show sort of almost a callous disregard for Mary and Martha. It's like, okay, I could have come a couple of days earlier.
Mm-hmm.
But look, cool it. I'm gonna heal him anyway, and this will allow God to be glorified. I mean, that's
right.
It's like, oh, okay, Jesus. I mean, it's not particularly endearing.
No.
Yeah, even if he's saying your brother will rise again, which again Martha hears on that, like, well, yeah, I know one day it's going to happen. Jesus might well be saying, no, I mean, like, I'm going to go get him right now, but it doesn't. It is so otherworldly or other thinking on such a different level that it doesn't come across as anything pastoral. Certainly not what you want your priest to say to you if you're in that situation and walk in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So for a while there, and this is more to do with the Luke story, right? The Luke story, if you remember, is Mary sits at the foot of Jesus and Martha's running around cleaning everything up and cooking and getting dinner ready. And then she gets mad and comes out and tells Jesus, I want Mary. Will you tell her to come in and help me?
Yeah.
Jesus basically goes, oh, Mary's chosen the better thing to be with me, kind of thing, and almost rebukes Martha, right? But it's interesting how this story almost relates to that, right? I mean, you also have this image of Martha as someone who takes charge and runs out on the road to meet Jesus, right? Mary's sitting at home crying, and Martha's the one who's out doing stuff one way or another. They had a book for a while there that was having a Mary heart and a Martha world, extolling the virtue of being closer to Jesus. Which is interesting and great, but I always, whenever I preach either of these lessons, I always say the same thing. The church really needs a whole lot of Marthas more than we need a bunch of Marys sitting around thinking about it. I need some people to do some stuff, not just patiently wait and think about it. But that said, it's interesting how that story does, in this case, actually seem to at least track with this story, that the characterizations of these two characters are similar.
Right.
All right. We'll look now at what Mary was doing, right? So when she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, the teacher is here and calling for you. When she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. Followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died, which is almost word for word what her sister said. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus began to weep. The Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? All right. So again, both sisters say almost the same thing. It's just the only difference is Martha comes out by herself. Mary comes out with her friends. The sort of accusation kind of process. But again, she just sort of dissolves into tears with her friends. She says the line, but then evidently just starts crying. And then what comes next actually needs a little bit of translation work. That is, this is one of those classic moments where people have an expectation of how Jesus would respond. And I think that gets laid on top of what the text actually says. So typically verse 33 gets softened. Jesus was disturbed in spirit and deeply moved, right? Which has this idea of something's going on, but it's not clear exactly what. He's upset, he's moved, but it's not clear what that means. In Greek, the first part of it is embryomai. It's easier said than that. Embryomai. And it means to snort with anger or even.
Oh my gosh.
It's a big old grunt, right? I mean, so this is not. You can see already when it says he's disturbed in spirit, is not really the same as he thundered.
It was snoring.
In anger and frustration. It's a very, very different turn of phrase. But so to put it together, he snorts with anger in the spirit is the more literal translation, or he thunders in the spirit. Then the second half, my Greek is leaving me. Etaraxen, which means disturbed. So literally the word translation, he disturbed himself or was troubled, deeply troubled within himself. It's much more than just he was moved, he was troubled. Right? There's something that has really, really deeply upset him. So it's better to say Jesus thundered in the spirit and was deeply shaken, which to me sounds a whole lot more like grief, raw grief, than simply, well, he had almost, again, that sort of otherworldly model, right, Lynn, of the Johannine Jesus that's above everything. Those are not lines that say he was above everything. Suddenly Jesus is in the middle of it with people in this, which is a very, again, this is one of those where translations matter. It's just interesting. Most translations that you will read will have Jesus, it will tame Jesus here and say that he was just upset or he was sad and worried or troubled. And you sort of go, well, yeah, but disturbed and thundering are different terms than worried and troubled, right?
What Eugene Peterson says in the Message is, when Jesus saw her sobbing and the Jews with her sobbing, a deep anger welled up within him. He said, "Where did you put him?"
Yeah. And I think that's a better he's much closer to, I think, what's intended there, right? Like there's a much clearer connection to being connected. And this is that classic thing that then a bunch of scholars will say, why was Jesus upset? Which is one of the more laughable questions, I feel like. But there is this question. Some people will say it's the lack of faith. They'll say it's because Mary and her friends are sobbing and don't have enough faith to realize that he can do this. I really don't like that answer, but that's what some scholars and preachers have taught about that, right? That Mary comes out and she's crying and her friends are crying and he's like, oh gosh, let me go fix this. He's all sort of mad at them for their response. I guess
they didn't know what he was going to do.
No. I mean, I guess that could be a response, but for me, nothing about the text says they lacked faith. They're just crying because their friend died. So it only says they are weeping, they're sobbing, right? So others will point and say that Jesus is angry at death itself, that he's frustrated that this is the way of the world. I suppose that could be it. But for me, I just think it's Jesus is grieving. I mean, he's lost his friend too. And he is responding to the community grieving around him, right? That maybe he is just deeply troubled in such a way that, and thundering away about how unfair death is in the midst of this and how unfair the situation is in his friend. Any of those can be answers. We don't honestly know. But the more important thing for me is to reclaim the fact that it is not Jesus sort of walking into the situation and very pacifically or sort of detached response saying, oh, well, I'm sorry you're sad. Let me go over here and help things. There's a much deeper connection. And again, for me, it's more about grief because then a verse later, he weeps, right? I mean, the one, Episcopalians don't know many verses, but most can say Jesus wept. They know that at least the shortest verse of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
That's there. The next one, Jesus wept.
Yeah.
The other side of it, though, is it's aorist, is the term. So it's a past action that stays in the past. Greek has two different types of past tense, but it probably should really be translated, he broke into tears. If you were going to say sobbing, then he sobbed, right? Jesus sobbed, because it's the same term that they, in both cases, in both what Mary and the Jews do, which is lachrysma, lacrima, tear, or in this case, it'd be the same thing, right? So they both broke into tears, or they both sobbed. He sobs with them. It's the exact same term used in both cases. So it's just to name it that there has this idea that, again, if he's snorting with anger and frustration and is deeply troubled, well, if it leads him to crying, then I would tend to say that it has more to do with grieving than it has to do with being angry at them for being upset or not believing or any other things that get laid on it.
Don't you think in the beginning, though, that he knew he was going to fix it, so he wasn't that upset? I mean, he was calm, but when he saw the pain that they had been suffering, or they were suffering, then he felt, that's why he broke into tears, to me.
I mean, well, it's a natural human reaction, right? Even if you think you can fix it and everything's okay.
Yeah.
There's still this very natural, like, well, everybody's crying and this is a horrible situation and a mess, and to cry with them is the most natural human response ever, right?
Right.
Even if you know how everything ends better.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to me, it's all, and I don't have an answer, but it makes me wonder about, again, about how the anger is directed. Is it directed at the Father because he's been given this task, to glorify the Father, and he's arrived here and he's seen the extreme pain and he feels the extreme pain himself? He can also be perhaps to some extent angry at himself for what he's done. But, it's as if, he was carrying out this plan and he got here and just the raw emotion overcomes him. And, it may just be, to some extent, undifferentiated anger, but it's this, sort of conflict between, the message and the actions and what's involved. And, to me, there's this, possible conflict between his mission to glorify and, the pain that he's encountered. I mean, he's here in the depths of the human experience. This is not, at the theological level.
Mm-hmm. Right. I like that. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, I mean, there is that sort of the being caught in the midst of his ministry and having to deal with something like this, or having to, if God asked him to let Lazarus die to prove his authority, right? I mean, yeah, there's all that too. So real quick, just to note, there is actually progression in Jesus's healing. His first healing is the official son, the man who is sick for a limited season. And you almost get the idea for the official son, it's like a virus or something, right? I mean, it's sort of, it's a healing, but not of a monumental level. And each one sort of progresses from there. Then there's the man who's sick for a limited season. Then there's a man who's sick for 38 years. And then there's the man blind from birth, right? And so you can pretty clearly see that there is, each time Jesus heals, it's sort of one up to the last one, until finally, obviously, this next one, healing the dead man, is obviously the next level indeed. But there is this progression of healing. The other thing is to name 4 days of death. That was typically the understanding in the ancient world, that after 3 days, the spirit leaves the body. And that was probably, again, born from the fact that you could have lead poisoning or a variety of things that would put you in a comatose state, that you might look dead for a day or two, and then wake back up from a sort of short-term coma. But after 4 days, people were pretty much like, oh, if you've been gone 4 days, you're gone. Like, you're not coming back. Anything else that we hear for this first part? We'll get into the healing itself, but So the next part, then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. Grave, and a stone was lying against it. And Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench because he has been dead for 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" They took away the stone, and Jesus looked upwards and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." All right. Here's the dramatic moment, but you also have to say that there's a slightly dark and perhaps darkly comedic tone. There is this point where they said, "Lord, he is going to stink." Martha's clear that it's been long enough that decomposition is going to happen. Don't go into the stench of death, and don't make us smell death, right? Don't make us be in the midst of this horrible situation. It's this door to stay closed between life. I remember laughing long ago reading this, and it was a King James version. And it said, "Lord, he stinketh," was the term. That was a funny turn of phrase. "Lord, he stinketh." Gets right down to it. Then we want a moment. We want this wonderful, sacred, holy moment, and we've probably all seen it in one of the Jesus movies, one way or another, where Lazarus walks from the grave, but his hands and feet are bound. So he's probably a hopping mummy when out of the grave. If we're going to take it literally, he's wrapped up, and this was a very common practice in the ancient world, that you would wrap someone tightly, because otherwise during rigor mortis, arms and body parts would, sort of stick out in awkward positions. People, you'd sort of just tie them all up. So again, it's sort of this funny moment and dramatic, right? I mean, this unbelievably holy, sacred, amazing, life-changing moment, world-changing moment of someone coming to life after having been dead. But then the reality is they are still wrapped up and tied up and still sort of part of death anyway, which I do think it's fair theologically to talk about a little, and that is, it is totally different from how Jesus will have his resurrection. They are pointed in the Gospel of John to say that his wrappings are carefully folded and sitting in a corner. When they go in to see where Jesus had been laid, they notice that those things that bound Lazarus and the cloth on his face are all very carefully folded and put away. The death cloths are put away very carefully by Jesus when he rises from the dead. So there's this extra level there of Lazarus is still bound up and to a certain degree by death, but Jesus completely conquers death, right? Or as C.S. Lewis famously said, "Poor Lazarus, he has all his dying to do again."
That's true.
Because he dies once and then he's got to go do it again, right?
Yeah.
What else do we hear in these? Again, it's an amazing moment, but what else do we hear in these moments?
Well, I think at any level, there's a lot of symbolism here. I can't help but think about a few years ago, I read Bishop Spong's commentary on the Gospel of John. And at the risk of troubling people, I would simply say on this part that Spong believes that Lazarus is a fictional character,
right? And
that the gospel writer has borrowed this name from the character in Luke, in the parable of Lazarus and the wise man, and that he is a stand-in for Israel of that day. As I recall, is the symbolic character. Yeah. But certainly, I think there's a lot of symbolism to the notion that he comes out still bound.
Mm-hmm.
I just think the hopping mummy is a.
You're mute. You're mute, Sheldon.
No, I can hear you. I can hear you. Oh,
I mean, the hopping mummy, I mean, just gives me some really interesting mental pictures there,
it is.
Yeah.
especially if it's supposed to be stinking.
But he wasn't stinking.
He didn't stink.
Nah, he didn't.
I'm trying to think. There was a book I read, one of the dramatizations of Jesus's life. It may have been Jose Saramago, but I don't think that's right. One of them, though, who talks about, I know, it's The Last Temptation of Christ. When Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead in The Last Temptation of Christ, he is healed, but not completely healed. He's alive, but he sort of smells bad because he has been decomposing. And there's this sort of character of almost the undead that happens there, that they're all like, oh, what did you see? What happened? Like, there's this really weird, everybody starts freaking out basically about Lazarus, which I thought was a fascinating way to look at this, and probably how it would work, right? Like if someone died and was gone for 4 days, like, what did you see? Where did you go?
Yeah.
What's on the other side?
What was it like? Yeah.
But you know, just almost, again, the way that Kazantzakis presents that is this idea of this guy who's sort of stuck between worlds in a weird way. He's brought back, but what on earth does it mean to be brought back in that situation? All right, so we'll look at the end of the chapter real quick. I didn't know if we'd have time or not, but we do. So many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what he had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the council and said, what are we going to do? Or what are we to do? This man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation. One of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all. You do not understand that it is better for you to have one man die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed. He did not say this on his own, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was about to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but to gather into one the dispersed children of God.
Wow.
From that day on, they planned to put him to death. Jesus therefore no longer walked about openly among the Jews, but went from there to a town called Ephraim, in the region near the wilderness, and he remained there with his disciples. Now, at the Passovers of the Jews was near, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. And they were looking for Jesus and were asking one another as they stood in the temple, what do you think? Surely he will not come to the festival, will he? The chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that anyone who knew where Jesus was should let them know, so that they might arrest him. So here is the biggest change, or one of the biggest changes in the Gospel of John versus the Synoptic Gospels. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus gets in trouble he comes in to the temple after the triumphal entry, and he overturns the money changers, right? And there is this situation where it's pretty much given the reason that Jesus is crucified is either because he denied having to pay taxes or he interfered with the commerce of the temple, right? He got in the way of the money, and that'll always get you in trouble. In this case, it is 100% because Jesus has proven himself to be too powerful. Anyone that controls life and death is way too scary, and you've got to get rid of this guy, or people are going to he's going to cause bigger problems, right? And so the express reason that Jesus is crucified in this is because it's better that one man die than the entire nation be destroyed. Too many people believe in him, and they try to throw off Rome or do whatever else, and so they have to kill him in order to save Jerusalem. great irony, of course, being it doesn't save Jerusalem. Jesus dies, and about 20, 30 years later, the Romans come in and burn the temple to the ground anyway. So you have lots of layers here, but it is a fascinating thing. And perhaps the most fascinating of all is that even in this plot to kill Jesus, God is still very much in charge, that God is prophesying even through Caiaphas, right? In ways that Caiaphas doesn't know he's prophesying. So you have lots of layers here, like you always do in a Johannine story. But in this case, even the bad guys, as it were, Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, are still part of God's plan. God's still completely in control of everything that's going on. It's not something outside of God's control or power, even though it's the people plotting against Jesus. What else do we hear in those final verses of this chapter? Uh-oh, duck's quacking. You also have this great moment that the conclusion of the chapter is all about the Jews are all gathering like, hey, what do you think? Is he going to make it to, is Jesus coming to the Passover, right? So you have this tension that is built. Chapter 11 leads into, of course, chapter 12, but chapter 12 is the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, right? But things are getting built up here where they all know that the Pharisees or the Sanhedrin and the authorities are out to get Jesus, and they're all looking for a showdown, is basically how this is set up, right? And this is how the rest of the book play out. What's going to happen in this showdown between the authorities, the religious authorities? How is this going to play out?
Yes, it's interesting that when it's written in hindsight, that the author's insight was there, that this was going to play out.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting to know if the people around Jesus were really aware at the time what was happening.
Yeah, it's always hard to tell, right? But yeah. I think actually all four Gospels on some levels seem to be pretty clear that Jesus had gotten the authorities so mad they were going to come after him one way or another, right? I think they all had enough of an idea, maybe not that it was going to lead to crucifixion, but certainly that they were going to arrest him or throw him in jail or beat him up or try and silence him one way or another. So yeah, that is one of those sort of questions that the historical Jesus group would ask. Like, what does it mean? How does that look? And how much of that is hindsight's 2020, right? Like you can see it perfectly looking back on it, but you may not have noticed it at all at the time. You would have been just happy to be walking with Jesus on the road and not realize he was about to get arrested or 1,000 other things are about to happen.
I wonder what percentage of the people actually supported Jesus. I know the chief priests and the Pharisees and the leadership was against him. They were the ones pursuing him. But there was also a lot of other people, a lot of other Jews. Sure. And I wonder how much support he had from them or not, for that matter.
That's a great question. It's probably, like I would guess, like anything, Roy, that Jesus obviously was starting to get some pretty serious momentum and a lot of people were believing him. If it was a small group of just 12 guys that were following him, I imagine Sanhedrin would have shrugged their shoulders and gone, oh, whatever, it's 12 guys. Let them talk about whatever they want, right?
Right.
I think there had to be enough of a gathering of people and enough people that were starting to believe or started to follow him that it was a threat to their authority. I don't know what percentage that would have to be. Or what numbers that would have to be, but it had to be enough to make them nervous enough to kill him.
I mean, recall when he was on trial and you heard the crowd, crucify him. You always wonder, is that just the leaders or is that
Yeah.
people who are non-leaders, other people. So
It's hard to say. I mean, the text will say that the Pharisees are whipping up the crowd to say it, but I have a feeling like everything Jesus did that, especially, and this is one reason why I do like the Gospel of John, around some of these things, is you always have, just like with the healing of Lazarus, right? Like Jesus raises someone from the dead, and there's a group of Jews that say, "Wow, we believe in this guy. This was amazing," and another group that saw it happen and go, "Oh, this is horrible. We got to go tell the Pharisees," right? There's this vision that very quickly happens. It's not just this sort of simplistic, everybody believes, oh, everybody's automatically on one side or the other. It seems like, oh no, Jesus comes and says some stuff, and either you really believe him or you really don't.
Yeah.
Right? He comes to bring division more than this sort of simple unity or simple answer to every question.
The footnotes in my Bible point out the irony of Caiaphas's statement here, that he's really articulating, the vision of the noble shepherd who lays down his life for his flock.
Right.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah, definitely. And we'll see that in the certainly in the Sanhedrin trial, that gets echoed again, of who's willing to lay down their life for the sheep and who's willing to break in and kill and destroy, right? We get that. Well, anything else, my friends? This has been great. This is a great chapter. This is a good one. The chapters ahead. So next week we have the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Jesus starts teaching. The hard thing is that then Jesus, after a couple of weeks, gets into a whole lot of exposition. It's called the high priestly prayer, and it goes on for about 4 chapters. So we'll have some fun stuff here for 2 or 3 weeks, and then suddenly we'll be in the deep end of the theological pool real quick.
glad you're with us, Bill.
Well, thank you. I don't know. I can decipher that either, but it is. We'll play with it. We'll see what we can do.
This is interesting.
Thank you.
Sure.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks,
Right.
everybody.
Thanks,
All
Bill.
right.
Bye.
All right. Have a good day, everybody.